Hey there, everyone. Today I'm very excited to do a lecture series on Shannon Bell's Fast Feminism. If you don't know anything about Shannon Bell, she teaches philosophy and critical theory at York University in Canada, and she's just a really wacky thinker, but in the best way possible. I've kind of followed her for a while, particularly her lectures that are available on YouTube are just phenomenal. The stuff she's done on Bataille and Deleuze and Guattari and Virilio, just lots of really good lectures that she does that I think are very accessible to anyone. But this work is just a particularly radical take on femininity, on identity, taking into account various postmodern thinkers, post-structuralists, critical theorists, queer theorists, all of this different stuff coalesces in this wonderful work. And today we're going to be looking at the first chapter, The Fast Feminist and Fast Feminism. Now, one of the things that makes fast feminism so interesting is that it is a form of performance philosophy. And if we want to understand what that means, she outlines it pretty clearly here on page 22, and she says, I have three principles of action. 1, theory must be grounded in action, otherwise it is dead. 2, and this is a quote from Bataille, we are to the degree that we risk ourselves. And 3, never write about what you don't do. So, she's worried about embodying philosophical thought. And she takes this in a number of different directions. One of her projects that she's done is shooting theory, where she basically takes various concepts like the Augenblick or Deleuze's deterritorialization, all these different concepts, and puts them into a visual format in the form of these kind of homemade movies that she makes. She admits that they're not like the highest production quality or whatever, but they go all over the world. She does like one on like sinkholes in Israel, all this different stuff. But the most important thing for Shannon Bell is figuring out how to do philosophy in a way that's really an anti-philosophy. And this is a concern of a lot of, postmodern thinkers in general. Is, okay, we had kind of our modern thinkers like Hegel, for example, and their philosophy was problematic or wrong for a number of reasons. One of which being, of course, at least, just for Hegel as an example, it was idealist. It thrived on creating this interior world based on something's resemblance to what I already know. It sort of thrived on this subject, which was a stable position of its own, and the object out there to be experienced. And how do we mediate between these? How do we evolve throughout history and whatnot? But in order to combat that, thinkers like Shannon Bell try to come up with a form of anti-philosophy which thrives on being in a space where it is forced to change, where it is forced up against its own limits. Thought itself has to think creatively. It's very Deleuzean in that regard. And as such, she wants to embody concepts in action in such a way that, you can only stretch experience so much if you're grounding your thought in experience instead of your experience in thought, like Hegel might have done. And one of the interesting literary techniques that Shannon Bell does here is, first off, she employs Virilio's style of writing, which is very schizo in many regards. An idea is developed just enough. We'll kind of get into some of the spots where she explains that more particularly. But the unique element here is the usage of FF. And FF can mean really 4 different things. And Shannon Bell has FF tattooed on her body. All of her tattoos tell very interesting stories that are just, I think that's really cool. But the first is that FF can be the name of the movement fast feminism. So fast feminism can be like, like idealism or postmodernism. It's like an ism. FF can also be the title of this book. So, FF can be that. FF can be the fast feminist, so the adherent of fast feminism. And it is also a gender-neutral pseudonym for Shannon Bell. So she'll say, FF does this, FF likes this, she'll personify it in a way where you can tell sometimes she's talking about herself, sometimes she's talking about this slightly ambiguous concept that she's creating. But one of the things that she likes to hold on to the most, that she takes from Virilio, is always do violence to the original context. So Virilio's thought is concerned with speed, acceleration, violence, the accident. And Bell likes that because it allows us to push thought to its very limits, to come to terms with various terms that are used unabashedly, even if they're problematic, for example. A good example of this is how she wants to build on the idea of the perverse. She says, it is easy to put oneself in the place of Levinas's window, orphan and stranger. It is not so easy to substitute oneself for the pervert, the publicly promiscuous bi-homosexual, the sadomasochist, the pedophile. And this is one of the things I love about Shannon Bell, is she has an affiliation, at least insofar as she writes about, Marquis de Sade. And the Marquis de Sade is one of my favorite authors. I think he has a lot to offer, a lot to teach us about action and how we live. But a lot of people get queasy about Sade, especially feminists, and they're like, no, we need to burn Sade. And of course, Simone de Beauvoir wrote an article, why we shouldn't burn Sade, or should we burn Sade, or something like that. But Shannon Bell is trying to craft an identity that splits at the seams, because anytime we form a conception of it as something stable, we do violence to it through new creative action. She writes here on page 14, the I of the text is a post-identity recognized by gait, movement, and speed. Speed necessitates rigorous control and precision, which surrenders to the failure of restraint. The work produced is thus simultaneously controlled and unrestrained. And that's really how Bell likes to do identity in general. Is the I needs to be led by what Deleuze calls the sober gesture. That one's self-identity needs to be like a homemade atom bomb. It's a question of tinkering in a minute and methodical way, but as Bell says, in a way which surrenders to the failure of restraint. So we have this simultaneous existence of a restrained, careful choice of action, combined with the explosivity of the world that necessarily fucks with our concepts. And the usage of sexual language in Bell's writing, I think, is one of its strong points. Because, sex, for example, can't help but get rid of some of our conceptions of what we think it ought to be, insofar as it's such a violently, pleasurable or just disruptive activity that it forces one to come outside of oneself. She quotes Kathy Acker, who says, when you write, are you controlling a text? When you're really writing, you're not. You're fucking with it. What you do when you bodybuild is work to failure. And this notion of fucking with a text is really interesting because in one of Shannon Bell's lectures where she presented shooting theory, and she was kind of going through some of the conceptual work behind it and whatnot, and some of the background, she too talks about fucking with a thinker. Because she has this idea of conceptual drift. And I'll have a link in the description to an article with the transcript as well as the video posted in this article. But she writes that conceptual drift takes a thinker's signature concept, maintains the original meaning, and simultaneously infuses additional, perhaps questionable meanings to take the original concept somewhere else. So it's not necessarily misreading thinkers. You maintain the meaning of what the thinker had in mind, but you push it to extremes whereby it has to tarry with phenomenon that maybe the author never thought about. Maybe for Deleuze, this is talking about the internet. Or maybe for Marx, this is talking about like modern finance or whatever, like stuff that they didn't really think about and that problematizes without destroying. And it morphs the concept in the process. But continuing on in this same quote, she writes, one of the people I like doing conceptual drift on, in fact, I just love doing conceptual drift on, is Heidegger. First off, I really like reading Heidegger. Second, I really like fucking with him because he so deserves it. And that's a very relatable quote, first off. But the idea of fucking with a concept, with an idea, of course, we can use that in the kind of colloquial sense of, oh, I'm just messing with them. I'm just, it's got a sort of comical connotation, a whimsicality about it. But of course, when we fully accept the sexual register of that language, it suddenly takes on a whole new meaning that Shannon Bell wants to grapple onto, of how can we use thought, but force thought to think anew, to come outside of itself, to work to failure, as Acker said. And in terms of developing ideas, she mentions Virilio, who has this staircase method of thinking. Virilio writes, I work in staircases. I begin a sentence, I work out an idea, and when I consider it suggestive enough, I jump a step to another idea without bothering with the development. Developments are the episodes. I try to reach the tendency. Tendency is the change of level. So, right, there's a big difference between developing a concept, because at a certain point, you can develop an identity all you want, but new experiences will destroy that conception of identity, especially if it's something radically new or traumatic, whatever it may be. So developing is one thing, but looking at the tendency that occurs when a major change happens, when you force something to come outside of itself, that's what Bell wants to focus on in her writing. Because Bell mentions here on page 16 that she's trying to do morphing, kind of building off of this staircase method. But she writes that morphing doesn't surgically cut and transplant as collage did. It genetically crossbreeds, producing a trans-textual chimera, a neo-breed of philosophy, pornography, and politics. So mixing in all these different fields, especially, pornography, and she's been publishing on all sorts of like female ejaculation, for example. She's one of the first people to publish academic stuff on that. She's combining all these fields together that they haven't gone together. The link between sex and politics kind of coalesces in the sexual politics, which was so important for second and third wave feminists. So for her, it's not so much grafting ideas in a way where they just peacefully coalesce like a collage. No, she wants this chimera, this trans-textuality of reaching across registers and seeing what happens. And in terms of connecting this to, a politics and an ethics, she writes, fast feminism is not concerned with fighting men, but rather with fighting injustices. Third wave injustices include economic, racial, and sexual inequalities, racism, child abuse, rape, domestic violence, homophobia, heterosexism, environmental degradation, classism, healthcare, and reproductive rights. Fast feminism is particularly concerned with the injustices meted out to pervert others. So, right, she's got some implicit ties there to Foucault, who is concerned with the mad and the perverse in its contingency, in its historical development, in its social instantiation, how it changes the way we view other people by seeing them as perverse. And Bell says, look, if you want to see us as perverse, okay. She says, third wave is about the right to do girl and not be written off as a girl. And the first girl is G-R-R-R-L. So, like girl? Girl reclaims the naughty, kick-ass, confident, loud, assertive, active, curious, prepubescent, joy for life tendencies that have been toned down, repressed, and castrated in turning woman. So, right, she wants to be loud. She wants to do what the girl does in Deleuze and Guattari, particularly in A Thousand Plateaus. And I've mentioned this in my lecture I did on children in theory, about the way that Deleuze and Guattari talk about the girl, for example. They slip in everywhere between orders, acts, sexes. They're a block of becoming. All this kind of transgressive language, but not transgressive insofar as it wants to become self-derogatory, but rather it's going to be willfully transgressive in the form of what Bell calls a flesh avatar. And that's really interesting because she's building off of the work of Stelarc, who's this crazy artist who mixes like cybernetics with self-expression and technology, and in this crazy way where one is necessarily linked to one's physiology, because something, of course, about being connected to that physiology is being connected to its limits. And when you get connected to those limits, your identity, through this very physical manifestation of change, forces you to come to terms with, your own changing self. So she kind of incorporates queer theory into here to focus on a very physically embodied, very radical notion of femininity and of queerness in terms of its oppositional relationship to hegemonic norms, is what she says. She says on page 19, to queer something is to disrupt it, to put it under scrutiny, and to attempt to change it. It is the world of those who refuse the rule. And that last quote is from Bataille once again. And the link to Bataille there is quite interesting because, just like Sade, Bataille is going to engage in themes of violence, transgression as, very much concerned with transgression of physical limits of the body that take one to all sorts of extremes. And for Bell, this is done, maybe not principally, but in a very key way in ejaculation. And she's done lots of work on female ejaculation. Very interesting concept. And she writes here on page 21, these days when I do ejaculation demonstrations and nude public performances, what meets the viewer's eye is not just a small muscular femme body, but an older small muscular femme body. A body that is not supposed to be seen, nor up until now to be sexed and sexualized. The obscenity is in the showing. The obscene seduction is in presenting a hypersexual, older, powerhouse femly, the female equivalent of manly, body. So she says that she wants to fuck with the signs of aging while presenting them. Literally, she's fucking with her own, she talks about wrinkles and about, just the way her body gets older. She says it doesn't matter how many years one has worked out or how long and how hard each time will get you. Perhaps that is why time is my most worthy and best endowed seducer. Time leaves no gender, no flesh, just pure intensity. And one of the interesting things is throughout the text, Bell willfully engages with the ways in which her identity has radically changed throughout the years. How at one point she identified more with like the butch notion, and now she goes for this kind of older, hyper-feminine, post-cyber-feminine, femme body. And by doing that, by looking at the ways in which her identity constantly changes, this length of time of just growing old in a body that continues to be active beyond the point of what one would expect, right? It's not supposed to be seen in the sense of, when you reach a certain age, you're not supposed to be in porn anymore or whatever. Instead, she wants to fuck with the signs of aging precisely by, making work with her body. So for Bell, she writes that fast feminism's politics are affective, to actively produce or effect change at the bodily and cellular levels and to be affected at these levels. She wants to do gender as escape velocity, getting rid of the post-menopausal, culturally positioned waste of time wasteland. And I think this is a really brave way of doing philosophy because, even within these very niche discourses of ejaculation, for example, and kind of the physiology of that, the philosophical or sociological implications or political implications of that, even within that, old age at some point becomes like a kind of silent stopping block of no, you can't go there. But for Bell, we're always experiencing and feeling things, so our philosophy should be feeling things too. It should be affective, and it should be concerned with accentuating these affects all the way up to the very limit. As she writes here on page 25, as with a lover, one should never be away from feminism long enough for the bruises to go away. So she willingly wants to take part in something risky. And this whole text is risky, and I think that's what makes it so exciting. So I hope you'll enjoy the future lectures I do on this video. It's a very exciting text, very interesting. I would recommend getting the text because a lot of the stuff that makes this text what it is the pictures, which are pornographic in nature and thus cannot be shown here on YouTube, fortunately or unfortunately. But that's it for this lecture. Check out any of my other stuff I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, critical theory, gender theory. Become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a monthly private philosophy Zoom that you can tailor to your needs. That's it, and I'll see you in another lecture.